Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly spectacular. The most embarrassing kings in medieval history. Not the glorious ones, not the ones who won epic battles or built magnificent castles. No, we're talking about the royals who face-planted so hard, so publicly and so catastrophically that centuries later we're still laughing. These are the kings who drowned in beer, died on the toilet, got killed by a pig, or lost entire kingdoms because they couldn't keep it in their pants. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to know who's falling asleep to medieval humiliation at 3 AM. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it takes to become a historically embarrassing monarch? Like, how bad does your decision-making have to be for people 800 years later to still be giggling about it? Could you lose a kingdom over a haircut? Would you accidentally start a war because you got too drunk at your own wedding? What's worse? Dying from eating too many eels, or dying because you fell off your horse while showing off? And how do you explain to your subjects that yes, technically you are their king, but also you just got captured while hiding in a monastery dressed as a nun? And now congratulations, you've just been crowned a medieval king. The year is somewhere between 1000 and 1500 CE. You have absolute power, unlimited wealth, and a truly astonishing talent for making the worst possible choice at every single opportunity. Your legacy is already doomed. Good luck. Let's start with perhaps the most spectacularly incompetent king in English history, King John. Not John the Great, not John the Wise, just John. Because even history couldn't be bothered to give him a nickname that wasn't an insult. This is the king who managed to lose an entire kingdom's worth of territory, get excommunicated by the Pope, nearly lose England itself, and oh yes, literally lose the crown jewels in quicksand. If there was a medieval award for most likely to screw everything up, John would have won it every single year of his reign. You become King of England in 1199, and immediately things start going sideways. Your older brother, Richard the Lionheart, was beloved, heroic, and spent most of his reign on crusade looking magnificent. You, on the other hand, stayed home, schemed against him, and earned the nickname Lackland because your father didn't trust you enough to give you any territory. Already you're starting from behind, but it gets worse, much worse. Within 5 years of becoming king, you've managed to lose Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, and most of your French territories to King Philip II of France. These weren't small losses. This was half your empire, gone. Your barons are furious, your subjects are embarrassed, and you're basically the medieval equivalent of someone who got promoted to CEO and immediately bankrupted the company. Then there's the Pope situation. In 1209 you get into a fight with Pope Innocent III over who gets to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. Seems like a reasonable political dispute, right? Wrong. The Pope excommunicates you, places all of England under interdict, meaning no church services, no weddings, no baptisms, no burials in consecrated ground, and declares that anyone who kills you won't go to hell for it. It's basically a medieval death warrant with papal approval. You hold out for 5 years, stubborn and defiant, before finally surrendering and agreeing to pay the Pope an annual tribute. So now you're not just a bad king, you're a bad king who has to pay rent to the Pope. Your barons have had enough. In 1215, they force you to sign the Magna Carta, a document limiting royal power and guaranteeing certain rights. It's one of the most important documents in constitutional history. For you, it's a humiliating public admission that you're so terrible at ruling that your own nobles had to legally tie your hands to stop you from ruining everything. You sign it, then immediately try to wriggle out of it, which triggers a civil war. Brilliant move. And now we get to the crown jewels. In 1216, while fleeing rebel forces, you're travelling through East Anglia with your entire treasury, including the crown jewels, royal regalia, and priceless relics. You decide to take a shortcut across a tidal estuary called the Wash. Your advisors warn you, the locals warn you, basic common sense warns you, but no, you're King John and you know best. You order your baggage train to cross at low tide. The tide comes in early, fast. The ground turns to quicksand, horses panic, wagons sink. And the entire treasure of the English crown disappears into the mud. Gold, jewels, crowns, sceptres, gone. Swallowed by the earth while you watch helplessly from the shore. It's like losing your car keys, except the keys are the physical symbols of your divine right to rule, and they're now at the bottom of a swamp. You die a few months later, possibly from dysentery, possibly from despair. And your legacy? You're the king that nobody wanted, who lost everything, who was so bad that 800 years later, no English monarch has dared to take the name John VI. Even kings who've been murdered or gone mad got sequels. You didn't. Now, you might think dying in battle is embarrassing, or maybe choking on your dinner. But Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad, and yes, that was his actual nickname, managed to die in a way so absurd it sounds like a rejected Monty Python sketch. In 1387, Charles was suffering from some kind of illness. His doctor prescribed a treatment that involved wrapping him head to toe in linen soaked in brandy. Sounds medieval, but okay. The problem. His servant, instead of carefully cutting the cloth with scissors, decided to just burn the excess thread off with a candle. You can probably guess what happened next. Charles, wrapped like a mummy in alcohol-soaked bandages, became a human torch. The moment the candle touched the cloth, he went up in flames. Instantly. We're talking full-body ignition. The room filled with smoke, the smell of burning flesh, and the screams of a king who was literally being cooked alive by his own medical treatment. His servants tried to put out the flames, but brandy-soaked linen burns fast and hot. By the time they managed to extinguish him, Charles was charred beyond recognition. He didn't die immediately, which somehow makes it worse. He lingered for days, his body a mass of third-degree burns in unimaginable agony, before finally succumbing. And all because his servant thought, you know what would be faster than scissors? Fire! Let's back up and talk about why Charles was called the Bad in the first place, because this wasn't a post-death nickname. People called him that while he was still alive. Charles spent his entire reign scheming, betraying allies, switching sides in wars, and generally being the kind of person you wouldn't trust to watch your sandwich, let alone rule a kingdom. He played the French and English off each other during the 100 Years' War, allying with whoever offered him the best deal at any given moment, and then immediately backstabbing them when a better offer came along. He tried to assassinate the King of France, multiple times. He poisoned political rivals. He started rebellions, then abandoned his own rebels when things got difficult. He was so untrustworthy that even his own family didn't like him. His mother reportedly said he was a disappointment. His wife avoided him. His children barely acknowledged him. When you're so consistently terrible that your own mother calls you out, that's an achievement. And yet, despite all this scheming and plotting and backstabbing, Charles didn't die in some dramatic political assassination or a heroic last stand. He died because a servant with a candle made a spectacularly bad decision. It's the medieval equivalent of surviving years of gang warfare, only to slip on a banana peel and break your neck. The chronicles of the time described his death in vivid, almost gleeful detail. Monks writing decades later still couldn't believe it. One account said the smell of a roasted king lingered in the room for weeks. Another said his own dogs wouldn't come near the chamber afterward. Whether that's true or medieval gossip, we'll never know. But what we do know is that Charles II of Navarre, schemer, traitor, and all-around terrible person, met his end not through poison or sword, but through the lethal combination of medieval medicine and an impatient servant with poor judgment. So the next time you think your doctor's treatment plan sounds questionable, just remember, it could be worse. At least they're probably not suggesting wrapping you in flammable cloth and bringing an open flame into the room. Charles the Bad's legacy isn't his political manoeuvring or his military campaigns. It's being the king who got barbecued by his own healthcare provider. George II had a reasonably successful reign. He won some battles, kept the kingdom running, and generally didn't embarrass himself too badly. And then, on October 25th, 1760, he ruined it all by dying on the toilet. Not just near the toilet, not in the bathroom, on the toilet. According to historical records, George was straining a bit too enthusiastically when his aorta ruptured. He collapsed and died instantly, his pants still around his ankles, his dignity gone forever. To make it worse, this wasn't a quick, quiet death discovered hours later. No, a servant heard a loud crash and found the King of England face down on the bathroom floor, in the least regal position imaginable. Picture the scene. It's early morning at Kensington Palace. George wakes up, has his usual cup of hot chocolate, because apparently that's what 18th century monarchs drank for breakfast, and then excuses himself to use the privy. It's a perfectly normal morning, a perfectly routine bathroom visit. And then, catastrophe. One moment he's sitting there, probably thinking about state business or what he's having for lunch, and the next moment his aorta just gives up. There's a crash so loud the servant outside hears it through the door. The poor servant opens the door and finds his king, the ruler of Great Britain, Ireland and the colonies, collapsed on the floor with his breeches around his ankles. This is not how you want to be remembered. This is not how you want to be found. But here we are. The servant, probably traumatized for life, calls for help. Doctors rush in. They confirm what everyone can already see. The king is dead, and there's absolutely no way to make this look dignified. Now, George's death wasn't entirely his fault. He was 76 years old, which in the 18th century was ancient. He'd lived through wars, political intrigue, family drama, and the constant stress of ruling an empire. His heart was probably a ticking time bomb. But still, the optics are terrible. You don't get to choose how you die, but if you could, on the toilet would be pretty low on the list. Somewhere between mauled by geese and tripping over your own wig. The royal family tried to keep the details quiet, but of course palace servants talk. Within days, everyone in London knew. Within weeks, everyone in Europe knew. George II, victor of the Battle of Dettingen, the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle, died straining on the privy. It's the kind of detail that overshadows everything else. You could conquer half the world, write brilliant laws, and commission magnificent art. But if you die on the toilet, that's your legacy. The official cause of death was listed as aortic dissection, which is accurate but doesn't capture the full humiliating picture. Modern doctors say it was probably caused by chronic constipation and high blood pressure, both of which are worsened by straining. So in a way, George's death was a public health announcement. Eat more fibre, don't push too hard, and maybe take it easy in your old age. His grandson, George III, inherited the throne, and immediately made sure that when he died it would be in bed, like a proper king. George II was given a state funeral, buried in Westminster Abbey with full honours, and everyone politely pretended not to remember the circumstances of his death. But they did remember. They always remember. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how successfully you ruled, or how many battles you won. If you die on the toilet, that's the story people tell. George VI, a decent king, a capable leader, and the man who proved that no amount of power can save you from an embarrassing exit. Speaking of toilets, let's talk about Edmund Ironside, who may or may not have been assassinated while using one. Edmund III, called Ironside because he was tough and strong, ruled England for about 7 months in 1016 before dying under mysterious circumstances. The official story? Natural causes. The unofficial story, the one whispered in taverns and written in chronicles by monks with too much time on their hands. An assassin hid in the cesspit beneath the royal privy, and, when Edmund sat down, stabbed him from below with a sword. Twice. Let's think about this for a second. You're Edmund Ironside. You've just spent months fighting off a Viking invasion led by Nut the Great. You've earned your nickname by being an absolute warrior, fighting battle after battle, refusing to surrender even when everyone else wanted to give up. You've finally negotiated a treaty, split the kingdom, and can breathe for the first time in months. You sit down to use the toilet and suddenly a sword comes up through the hole and stabs you in the most vulnerable position imaginable. Is this story true? Historians are genuinely divided. Some say absolutely not. It's medieval propaganda designed to make Edmund's enemies look especially villainous. Others say, well, actually it's not impossible. Medieval toilets were just holes over pits, and assassins did hide in some truly disgusting places to kill their targets. So maybe, just maybe, someone really did crawl into a cesspit, wait in literal human waste and stab a king from below. The logistics alone are nightmare fuel. Picture this. You're the assassin. Someone, probably a rival noble or maybe Nut himself, offers you money to kill the king. You agree, and then they explain the plan. You have to climb down into the royal cesspit, the stone-lined pit beneath the king's toilet where all the waste collects, and wait, in the dark, in the stench. surrounded by months, maybe years of accumulated filth. You have to stand there, sword in hand, breathing through your mouth because your nose has given up, and wait for the king to sit down. Then you have to aim upward, through a relatively small hole, and stab accurately enough to kill him. Twice! It's either the most dedicated assassination in history or complete fiction. But here's the thing. Multiple chronicles mention it. Not just one drunk monk making things up, but several independent sources from the period. One account says the assassin was the son of a nobleman Edmund had wronged. Another says it was a hired killer paid by Knut's allies. A third says Edmund survived the first stab, screamed, and was finished off by a second thrust before anyone could help him. Whether it's true or not, Edmund died in November 1016, and Knut became king of all England shortly after. Convenient timing. Edmund's death cleared the way for Knut's total control, which is why conspiracy theories swirled immediately. The official story was that Edmund died of natural causes, possibly wounds from battle or illness. But natural causes are boring. A toilet assassination? That's a story that sticks. And honestly, even if it's not true, the fact that people believed it says something. Medieval politics was so ruthless, so brutal, that hiding in a cesspit to stab a king didn't seem implausible. It was just another Tuesday in 1016. People had seen worse. So Edmund Ironside, tough warrior, survivor of countless battles, possibly met his end not on the battlefield but on the toilet, betrayed by the one moment every human being is completely defenceless. It's the medieval equivalent of dying while checking your phone. You think you're safe. You think you have a moment of peace. And then, surprise, a sword from below. Whether it happened or not, Edmund's death became legend, and the lesson is clear. In medieval England, you were never truly safe, not even on the toilet. Henry I was a successful king. He ruled England and Normandy for 35 years, kept the peace, built castles, reformed laws, and generally did a decent job. And then he ruined it all by eating too many lampreys. Lampreys, if you're not familiar, are disgusting eel-like fish with circular mouths full of teeth. They latch onto other fish and suck their blood. Medieval people, for reasons no one can explain, thought they were delicious. Henry I thought they were so delicious that in 1135, despite his doctor explicitly warning him not to eat them, he gorged himself on a surfeit of lampreys and promptly died of food poisoning. Let's be clear about what lampreys are. They're not even real fish. They're parasitic, jawless vertebrates that look like something from a nightmare. They have no bones, just cartilage. Their mouths are circular and lined with rows of sharp teeth that rasp away at flesh. They're basically swimming horror shows, and medieval nobles looked at them and said, "Yes, that. I want to eat that, preferably in large quantities." Henry loved them. He loved them so much that his personal physician repeatedly told him to stop eating them. Not because they were gross, though they were, but because they clearly disagreed with his digestive system. Every time Henry ate lampreys, he got sick. Stomach pain, nausea, the works. His doctor warned him. His advisors warned him. Probably his wife warned him. But Henry was the king, and if the king wants to eat blood-sucking nightmare fish, nobody can stop him. In December 1135, Henry was staying at a hunting lodge in Normandy. He'd had a good day, he was in high spirits, and then dinner arrived, and it included his favourite, lampreys. Fresh, cooked in wine and spices, probably glazed with something expensive. Henry looked at the plate. His doctor, standing nearby, probably shook his head. Henry smiled, picked up his fork and proceeded to eat an enormous amount of lampreys. Not just one or two, a surfeit. That's the word the chronicles use. A surfeit. Which is medieval speak for way too many. Within hours, Henry was violently ill. Vomiting, fever, abdominal pain so severe he couldn't stand. This wasn't mild food poisoning. This was full-body rebellion. His doctors tried everything they knew, which in the 12th century meant bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayer. None of it worked. Henry deteriorated rapidly, and within a week he was dead, killed by his own stubbornness and an excessive love of parasitic fish. The kingdom was thrown into chaos. Henry's only legitimate son had died years earlier in a shipwreck, and his daughter Matilda was supposed to inherit, but medieval England wasn't thrilled about having a queen. Henry's death triggered a civil war that lasted nearly 20 years, known as the Anarchy, where the kingdom tore itself apart over succession. all because a king couldn't resist eating one more lamprey. Chroniclers at the time were almost gleeful in their descriptions. One wrote that Henry indulged too freely in the food he loved and paid the price. Another said he died of a surfeit, as often happens to the gluttonous. There's a definite tone of "we told you so" in medieval accounts. Even back then, people recognised the absurdity. A powerful, intelligent king brought down by a plate of fish. Modern historians think it probably wasn't just food poisoning. Lampreys can carry toxins, especially if improperly prepared. They can also exacerbate existing conditions like gout or heart disease, both of which Henry likely had at age 67. So it's possible the lampreys triggered something more serious, like a heart attack or stroke. But the official record says lampreys, and that's what stuck. Henry I ruled for 35 years. He defeated his brothers, consolidated power, reformed the legal system, and strengthened the monarchy. But when people remember him, they don't think about his accomplishments, they think about the lampreys. Because no matter how successful you are, if you die from eating too many nightmare eels after your doctor specifically told you not to, that's your legacy. Henry the Warm, good king, terrible listener, killed by his own appetite. Philip III of France started his reign in 1060 with promise. Young, capable, ready to rule. But by the 1090s, things had gone downhill. Specifically, Philip had gone downhill. Way downhill. He got so enormously fat that he could no longer ride a horse, walk for more than a few steps, or even fit through normal doorways. This was a problem because medieval kingship required being seen, leading armies, and generally doing things that involved movement. Philip couldn't do any of that. He spent his final years essentially bedridden, unable to govern, while his son ran the kingdom. Let's talk about what enormously fat meant in medieval terms. We're not talking about someone who gained a few pounds and needed new clothes. We're talking about a man so large that chroniclers described him as corpulent beyond measure, and said his belly was of immense size. One account claimed that when Philip tried to mount a horse, the horse collapsed. Another said he broke furniture just by sitting on it. These might be exaggerations, medieval writers loved drama, but the fact remains that Philip's weight became a national issue. In the 11th century, being a king meant being visible. You had to ride at the front of your army, attend public ceremonies, tour your lands, and project strength. Your physical presence was your legitimacy. If your nobles couldn't see you, they started questioning whether you were even alive, let alone fit to rule. Philip couldn't do any of this. He couldn't ride a horse without assistance. He couldn't walk more than a few steps without becoming winded. He couldn't stand for long periods. Essentially, he became a king in name only, stuck in his palace while the world moved on without him. His weight also became a political liability. When the First Crusade was called in 1095, every major European ruler either went themselves or sent armies. Philip did neither. Why? Because he physically couldn't. Pope Urban II personally asked him to join, to lead the Christian forces to be the face of the crusade. Philip said no, not because he was against it, but because he knew he couldn't sit on a horse for more than an hour without needing to stop. Imagine being so unfit that you have to decline a holy war because you can't make the commute. His nobles started mocking him, behind his back at first, then openly. They called him Philip the Fat, though not to his face because technically he was still king and could have you executed. But the damage was done, his authority crumbled. His son, Louis VI, who was ironically nicknamed Louis the Fat, as well but was at least functional, began taking over royal duties in the 1100s while Philip was still alive. It was a soft coup, no violence, no drama, just a son stepping in because his father literally couldn't get out of bed. And it wasn't just his weight. Philip made terrible personal decisions that compounded his problems. In 1092, he had his marriage annulled so he could marry Bertrade de Montfort, who was already married to someone else. The Pope excommunicated him. His reputation, already damaged by his obesity, was now completely in tatters. He was too fat to fight the excommunication politically, and too unpopular to rally support. By the time Philip died in 1108, he'd been effectively retired for years. His death was almost an afterthought. The chronicles barely mention it. One account says he died heavy with years and flesh, which is possibly the most medieval way to say someone ate themselves into an early grave. He was 56, which wasn't ancient, but his body had given up decades earlier. Philip's reign started with potential and ended with him physically unable to perform the basic duties of kingship. He wasn't overthrown, he wasn't assassinated, he simply became too large to function, and the kingdom moved on without him. It's a cautionary tale about excess, about how even unlimited power can't overcome basic biology, and about how a king who can't leave his bedroom eventually stops being a king at all. Philip the Fountained. Started strong, ended horizontal, remembered mostly for not fitting through doors. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, suffered from severe mental illness throughout his reign. And while that's tragic, some of his delusions were so bizarre they've become legendary. The most famous, Charles became convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. He refused to let people near him, had iron rods sewn into his clothes to protect himself, and reportedly screamed in terror if anyone came too close. Court officials had to tiptoe around him, literally and figuratively, trying to govern a kingdom while their king believed he was a very fragile vase. Imagine being a French nobleman in 1405. You need to discuss important matters of state with the king, war with England, taxes, alliances, serious stuff. You enter the throne room, and there's Charles, standing perfectly still in the corner, wearing a specially reinforced doublet with metal bars sewn into it, refusing to move because he thinks any sudden motion will cause him to crack like a dropped wine glass. You try to approach. He screams. Guards step in, gently reminding you that His Majesty cannot be touched, spoken to loudly, or approached from behind because it might startle him and cause catastrophic structural failure. This wasn't a one-time episode. The glass delusion lasted for years. Charles would stand motionless for hours, terrified that sitting down too hard might shatter his legs. He refused to travel in carriages because the bumps in the road might crack him. He had servants pad the floors and walls of his chambers. When he absolutely had to move, he shuffled along slowly, arms out for balance, like someone crossing a frozen lake. His courtiers had to conduct business from across the room, shouting their reports while Charles nodded carefully, terrified that nodding too vigorously might snap his neck. It gets weirder. Charles didn't always think he was glass. Sometimes he had other delusions. For a period, he believed he was St. George and demanded to be addressed as such. Another time, he forgot he was king entirely and didn't recognise his own wife or children. He once ran through the palace screaming that enemies were chasing him, though no one else could see them. During one particularly disturbing episode, he believed his name was Georges, and that he had no connection to the royal family whatsoever. His attendants had to play along until the delusion passed, but the glass delusion was the most persistent and the most disruptive. The glass delusion, as historians call it, was actually a documented psychological condition in the medieval and early modern period. Multiple people, mostly upper class and educated, became convinced they were made of glass. It was the early version of a culturally specific mental illness, like how some modern anxiety manifests as fear of technology or germs. For Charles, it meant his reign became a series of carefully choreographed scenes where everyone pretended the king wasn't completely detached from reality. His mental state made France vulnerable. The 100 Years' War with England was ongoing, and France needed strong leadership. Instead, they had a king who couldn't make decisions because he thought he might break. His uncles and cousins seized power, fighting among themselves for control while Charles stood frozen in his glass prison. The kingdom descended into civil war between rival factions, the Armagnacs and Burgundians, both claiming to act in the king's name while he was literally afraid to move. Charles's wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to manage the situation but eventually gave up and had affairs, which scandalised the court. His son, the Dauphin, was essentially sidelined, and through it all Charles remained convinced that one wrong move, one careless touch, would shatter him into 1,000 pieces. He died in 1422, still believing he was made of glass, having spent the last 2 decades of his reign as a fragile, immobile figurehead. His kingdom was in ruins, occupied by the English, torn apart by civil war. But at least in his mind, he never broke. Charles still sick, a king who ruled France but couldn't rule his own mind, forever trapped in a body he believed was one touch away from destruction. Wenceslaus IV was known for his terrible temper and his even worse decision-making. But his most infamous moment came in 1393 when he got so angry at his cook for serving him a bad meal that he had the man roasted alive on a spit. Yes, roasted, like a chicken. The cook's crime? Overcooking the meat or maybe undercooking it, sources disagree. Either way, Wenceslaus's response was to literally cook the cook. This did not go over well with his subjects, who already thought he was an unstable tyrant. Wenceslaus was eventually deposed, imprisoned, and died in disgrace. Let's set the scene. You're the royal cook. You've been working all day preparing a feast for King Wenceslaus. The meat is tricky, timing is everything, and the king is known for his explosive rage. You do your best. You serve the meal. The king takes one bite and his face goes dark. He doesn't send the plate back. He doesn't fire you. He doesn't even yell. He calmly orders his guards to seize you, drag you to the courtyard, build a fire, and roast you alive on the same spit you used to cook his disappointing dinner. And they do it. Because when a medieval king with anger management issues gives an order, people follow it, no matter how deranged. The cook is tied to a spit, positioned over an open fire, and slowly rotated while the flames cook him alive. It's grotesque, it's barbaric, and it's also incredibly on brand for Wenceslaus, who by 1393 had already earned a reputation as one of Europe's most volatile and unpredictable rulers. This wasn't an isolated incident of cruelty. Wenceslaus had a long history of violent outbursts. He once threw a man out of a window for disagreeing with him. He imprisoned nobles who questioned his decisions, sometimes for years without trial. He had monks tortured for preaching sermons he didn't like. But roasting a cook alive was a new low, even for him. It crossed a line from tyrannical to cartoonishly evil. His subjects were horrified. Nobles who had tolerated his other abuses began plotting against him. The church, already furious with Wenceslaus for various political disputes, used the incident as proof of his unfitness to rule. Even his own family started distancing themselves. When a king's response to a bad meal is murder by slow roasting, people start wondering if maybe it's time for new leadership. But Wenceslaus didn't care. He doubled down on his behaviour, drinking heavily, lashing out at advisors, and refusing to govern effectively. By the late 1390s, Bohemia was in chaos. The nobility rebelled multiple times. Wenceslaus was captured and imprisoned by his own cousin in 1394, then released, then captured again in 1402. He spent more time in captivity than on the throne during the final decades of his reign. His drinking got worse. Some accounts describe him as drunk more often than sober, making erratic decisions and falling into violent rages over trivial matters. He alienated allies, lost wars, and watched his kingdom descend into instability. And through it all, the story of the roasted cook followed him. It became the defining anecdote of his reign, the moment everyone pointed to when they wanted to explain why Wenceslaus was unfit to rule. Here's the thing, we don't know for certain if the story is true. Some historians think it's exaggerated or entirely fabricated by Wenceslaus's enemies to justify deposing him. But the fact that people believed it, that it spread across Europe and was repeated in chronicles for centuries, tells you everything about his reputation. Whether he actually roasted his cook or not, everyone thought he was capable of it. And in medieval politics, perception was reality. Wenceslaus died in 1419, unmourned and largely forgotten by history except as a cautionary tale. He'd been king of Bohemia for decades, and Holy Roman Emperor-elect, titles that should have made him one of the most powerful men in Europe. Instead, he's remembered as the king who maybe, possibly, definitely roasted a man alive because dinner wasn't quite right. Wenceslaus IV, proof that absolute power plus a short temper equals absolute disaster, preferably served medium rare. Martin Thias of Aragon died in 1410, and the cause of death is one of the strangest in royal history. According to chroniclers, Martin ate an entire roasted goose for dinner, which gave him severe indigestion. While lying in bed, suffering, his court jester came in to cheer him up and told him a joke. Martin laughed so hard that he ruptured something internally and died. To this day, historians aren't sure if the story is true or if it's medieval propaganda, but either way, the official cause of death is listed as laughing too hard after eating too much goose. Let's break this down. Martin, King of Aragon, Sicily and various other territories, is having dinner. Someone serves him a whole roasted goose. Not a slice, not a portion, the entire bird. And Martin, displaying the kind of restraint that clearly runs in royal families, eats the whole thing, all of it, every bit of greasy, fatty, difficult-to-digest goose meat. His stomach immediately protests. He's bloated, nauseous, cramping. He goes to bed, groaning, probably swearing he'll never eat goose again. His servants are worried. The king is clearly unwell. Someone suggests calling a doctor. Someone else suggests maybe just letting him sleep it off. And then, in what might be the worst timed attempt at comedy in history, his court jester decides this is the perfect moment to cheer the king up. The jester enters the royal bedchamber, where Martin is lying in gastric agony, and proceeds to tell a joke. We don't know what the joke was. History has cruelly denied us this detail. Was it a dirty joke? A pun? A funny story about a peasant and a donkey? Whatever it was, Martin found it hilarious. He started laughing, and he couldn't stop. He laughed and laughed, his swollen belly shaking, his diaphragm spasming, putting pressure on internal organs that were already stressed from processing an entire goose. And then, mid-laugh, something gave way. A hernia, an aneurysm, internal bleeding, something catastrophic. Martin stopped laughing, and within hours he was dead. The jester, understandably, was probably traumatized for life. Imagine your job is to make people laugh, and you're so good at it that you accidentally kill the king. That's not going on your resume, that's not a story you tell at parties, that's a change your name and move to a different kingdom situation. Now, modern historians have some theories. Martin was 53, overweight, and had a history of health problems. The goose probably triggered acute indigestion or even a gallbladder attack. The laughter could have caused a rupture in a pre-existing hernia, or an aortic aneurysm that was ready to burst anyway. So it's not that the joke literally killed him, it's that the joke was the final straw for a body already in crisis. But that's not as funny, and medieval chroniclers preferred the version where a king died laughing. The timing couldn't have been worse. Martin had no direct heirs, which meant his death triggered a succession crisis. Aragon was thrown into political chaos as various claimants fought for the throne. The kingdom that Martin had held together barely fell apart within months. All because he ate too much goose and someone told him a really good joke. Some historians think the story was invented or exaggerated to make Martin's death seem less suspicious. Maybe he was poisoned. Maybe there was foul play. But instead of investigating, everyone just said, "Oh, he laughed himself to death after eating goose," and moved on. It's the medieval equivalent of "he fell down the stairs." Convenient, bizarre, and just plausible enough to be believed. But whether it's true or not, Martin the Man of Aragon's legacy is sealed. He's the king who died laughing. Not in battle, not from old age, not even from normal overeating. He died because he had no self-control at dinner, his jester had excellent timing, and his body decided it had had enough. Martin I ruled multiple kingdoms, died because of poultry and punchlines, and left behind a succession crisis and one very nervous jester. Belarai became king of Hungary in 1060 through a combination of military skill and political manoeuvring. He should have been a successful ruler. Instead, in 1063, while sitting on his throne, the wooden canopy above him collapsed and crushed him to death. Just fell right on his head. Some say it was an assassination, that someone sabotaged the structure. Others say it was just shoddy medieval carpentry. Either way, Bela died not in battle, not from illness, but from being hit by his own furniture. Picture this. You've spent years fighting for the throne. You've survived battles, political intrigue, assassination attempts and family betrayals. You've finally made it. You're the king. You sit down on your throne, probably feeling pretty good about yourself, ready to dispense justice and issue royal decrees, and then the ceiling falls on you. No warning, no dramatic music, just gravity, wood, and the sudden realization that maybe someone should have checked the structural integrity of the throne room. Medieval thrones weren't just chairs. They were statements of power, massive pieces of furniture designed to make the king look important. Many had elaborate canopies, carved wooden or stone structures that towered overhead, draped with fabric, sometimes adorned with religious symbols or royal insignia. Bela's throne was no exception. It was grand, impressive, and apparently held together with hope and questionable joinery. On that fateful day in 1063, Bela was holding court. Nobles were present, petitioners were waiting, and everything was proceeding normally. Then, without warning, the canopy gave way. Massive wooden beams, heavy fabric, possibly some decorative stonework, all came crashing down directly onto the king's head. There was no time to move, no time to shout a warning. One moment Bela was sitting on his throne like a proper king. The next moment he was buried under rubble. Courtiers rushed forward, pulling debris off their king, but the damage was done. Bela had been struck on the head and upper body with enough force to cause fatal injuries. Some accounts say he died instantly. Others say he lingered for a few hours, conscious but mortally wounded, which is somehow worse. Imagine knowing you're dying because your throne betrayed you. The question everyone asked immediately was, accident or assassination? Medieval Hungary was politically unstable. Bela had enemies, rival claimants to the throne, nobles who resented his rule. It wouldn't have been difficult to sabotage the throne's canopy, to weaken the supports just enough that they'd fail at the right moment, and the timing was suspicious. Bela had recently dealt with rebellions and was consolidating power. Killing him would have thrown the kingdom back into chaos, which is exactly what happened after his death. But it's also possible that it really was just an accident. Medieval construction wasn't known for its safety standards. Buildings collapsed all the time. Roofs caved in, towers fell, wood rotted, termites ate through supports. Maybe nobody checked the throne room's structural integrity in years. Maybe the canopy was just old and tired and decided that particular Tuesday was a good day to quit. Occam's razor suggests the simplest explanation is often correct, and shoddy carpentry is pretty simple. Either way, Belafon's death is objectively ridiculous. You expect kings to die heroically in battle, to be poisoned by rivals, or to succumb to illness. You don't expect them to be killed by interior decorating. It's the medieval equivalent of dying because a bookshelf fell on you. Technically it's tragic, but also, come on. His death sparked another succession crisis, because of course it did. His sons were too young to rule, rival factions emerged, and Hungary descended into years of instability and civil conflict. All because someone, either maliciously or incompetently, didn't properly secure a wooden canopy. The lesson here is clear. Even when you've won the crown, defeated your enemies, and secured your throne, you're never truly safe. Not from assassins, not from disease, and definitely not from furniture. Bela III fought his way to the throne, literally died on it, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the throne room is the throne itself. Adolf Fredrik ruled Sweden in the 18th century, which is a bit later than medieval, but his death is too ridiculous not to include. On February 12th, 1791, Adolf Fredrik attended a massive feast and ate himself to death. Literally. The meal included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, champagne, and 14 servings of his favourite dessert, semla, a sweet cream-filled pastry. He ate so much that his stomach ruptured and he died. To this day, Swedes refer to semla as the king's dessert, and Adolf Fredrik is remembered primarily for dying because he couldn't stop eating pastries. Let's appreciate the full menu here. Adolf Fredrik started with lobster, which is rich and filling, then caviar, salty and dense, then sauerkraut, which is fermented cabbage, not exactly light, then kippers, smoked fish. He's washing all of this down with champagne, which is carbonated and takes up space in your stomach. At this point, a reasonable person would unbutton their pants, lean back, and call it a night. Adolf Fredrik was not a reasonable person, because now comes dessert, semla. For those unfamiliar, semla is a Swedish pastry, a wheat bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream, served in a bowl of hot milk. It's delicious. It's also incredibly heavy. 1 semla is a struggle. 2 is ambitious. Adolf Fredrik ate 14. 14. He didn't stop at 10 and think, you know, maybe I should pace myself. He powered through to 14 like a man possessed. His courtiers watched in fascinated horror. Some probably tried to suggest he slow down. Others probably placed bets on how many he could finish. Nobody stopped him because he was the king, and if the king wants to eat himself into oblivion, that's his royal prerogative. By the end of the meal, Adolf Fredrik was reportedly pale, sweating, and clearly in distress. He excused himself, went to his chambers, and collapsed. Doctors were summoned. They tried everything they knew, which in the 18th century meant bloodletting, purging, and hoping for the best. Nothing worked. Adolf Frederick's stomach, stretched beyond capacity, had ruptured. Internal bleeding, sepsis and shock followed. He died later that night. His final thoughts probably something along the lines of, "That last Semler was a mistake." The official cause of death was listed as digestion problems, which is possibly the most diplomatic way to say ate himself to death. Swedish newspapers reported it with barely concealed amusement. Foreign courts gossiped about it for months. And Semler, previously just a popular Lent pastry, became forever associated with the king who loved it too much. Here's the thing. Adolf Frederick wasn't a terrible king. He was politically weak, essentially a puppet of the Swedish parliament, but he wasn't cruel or incompetent. He just had zero self-control when it came to food, and in fairness, Semler is really good. But there's a difference between enjoying dessert and eating 14 servings until your internal organs give up. Modern doctors have speculated about what exactly happened. A stomach rupture, or gastric rupture, is extremely rare but can occur when the stomach is filled beyond its absolute limit and can't expand any further. The tissue tears, stomach contents spill into the abdominal cavity, and without modern surgery it's fatal. Adolf Frederick essentially ate until his stomach exploded. It's one of the few ways you can literally kill yourself with food in a single sitting. Sweden mourned, sort of. His son Gustav III took the throne and proved to be much more capable, though he had the good sense not to eat 14 of anything in one sitting. And Semler remained a national favourite, now with the added dark humour of being the dessert that killed a king. Every year on Fat Tuesday, Swedes eat Semler to celebrate the beginning of Lent. And every year someone inevitably jokes about Adolf Frederick, the king who took Mardi Gras a little too seriously. His portrait hangs in museums, dignified and regal. But everyone who sees it knows the truth. That man died because he couldn't say no to pastry. Number 12, 13, or 14. Adolf Frederick ruled Sweden for 20 years, died because he treated a feast like a competitive eating contest, and left behind a legacy of cream-filled regret. The lesson? There's no crown grand enough to protect you from your own bad decisions, especially when those decisions involve double-digit desserts. William II, also called William Rufus because of his red hair and even redder face, died in 1100 during a hunting trip in the New Forest. He was shot through the lung with an arrow, allegedly by a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, who claimed it was a tragic accident. The arrow, according to Tyrrell, bounced off a stag and hit the king. William died instantly. Tyrrell fled to France and was never punished. William's brother, Henry, conveniently happened to be nearby and immediately rode to Winchester to claim the throne. Suspicious? Absolutely. Embarrassing? Definitely. William's body was left in the forest and eventually carted away by a peasant in a wagon like a sack of turnips. Let's examine the official story. William and his hunting party are in the New Forest, a royal hunting ground. It's August 2nd, 1100, a beautiful summer day. William is with several nobles, including Walter Tyrrell, a skilled archer and trusted companion. They're tracking deer. Suddenly a stag appears. Tyrrell shoots. The arrow somehow deflects off the animal, flies through the air at an improbable angle, and strikes William directly in the chest, piercing his lung. William dies almost immediately without saying a word. Tyrrell, realising what's happened, panics and flees to the coast, sails to France, and disappears into Normandy. He's never prosecuted, never questioned, and lives a comfortable life for decades afterward. Meanwhile, William's brother Henry, who was also on the hunting trip but conveniently in a different part of the forest, hears the news and doesn't even stop to check on his brother's body. He rides straight to Winchester, seizes the royal treasury, and has himself crowned king within days. William's corpse? Left in the forest. Eventually, a peasant named Purkis finds the body, loads it onto his cart like firewood, and hauls it to Winchester Cathedral where it's buried without ceremony. No investigation, no trial, no questions asked. Does this sound like an accident to you? Because it sounds like the medieval version of he fell down the stairs. The whole thing reeks of conspiracy. William was unpopular with the church because he kept bishoprics vacant so he could pocket their revenues. He was unpopular with nobles because he was arrogant and demanding, and he was unpopular with his own family because they wanted his throne. Henry had motive, opportunity and ambition. Walter Tyrrell had noble connections and a convenient escape route. and somehow an experienced archer's arrow bounced off a deer at just the right angle to kill a king. Some historians believe it was absolutely an assassination. The deflected arrow story is too convenient, too improbable. More likely, Tyrrell was either the assassin or the patsy. Maybe Henry paid him. Maybe other nobles orchestrated it. Maybe William was shot deliberately and everyone agreed to call it an accident because nobody liked him enough to demand justice. Medieval politics were ruthless, and William had made enough enemies that his death probably came as a relief to most people. But here's what makes it embarrassing beyond the suspicious circumstances. William's death was so undignified. He died in the dirt, bleeding out in a forest, and then was abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect him. His brother didn't mourn, his nobles didn't investigate. His body was transported by a random peasant who probably just wanted to get the corpse off his land. William II, King of England, ended up in the back of a cart next to someone's turnips, bouncing along dirt roads to his burial. And nobody cared. There was no state funeral, no period of mourning, no attempts to find justice. Henry became king, Tyrrell stayed in France, and everyone moved on as if William had never existed. Chronicles from the period barely mention his death. Some monks even wrote that it was divine punishment for William's sins against the church, which is medieval speak for he had it coming. The New Forest, where William died, was already considered cursed. William's own nephew had died there in a hunting accident years earlier. Local people believed it was haunted, that the trees themselves were angry because William the Conqueror had evicted entire villages to create the royal hunting ground. So when William Rufus died there too, people said it was justice, karma, the forest taking revenge. William II ruled for 13 years, probably assassinated, definitely abandoned, and carted to his grave like a load of vegetables. Whether it was murder or the world's most convenient accident, the result was the same. A king dead in the dirt, unmourned and quickly forgotten, replaced by a brother who couldn't even pretend to be sad about it. James II of Scotland loved cannons, loved them. He was obsessed with military technology and personally oversaw the use of artillery in his sieges. In 1460, while besieging Roxburgh Castle, James stood too close to one of his new cannons as it fired. The cannon exploded, sending shrapnel everywhere. A piece of it hit James in the face and killed him instantly. His death was so sudden and so unnecessary that his own soldiers reportedly just stood there in stunned silence before someone finally yelled, "The king is dead! Also, maybe stand further back next time." James II wasn't just a king who liked cannons. He was a king who was obsessed with them. He collected them, commissioned new designs, and insisted on being present whenever they were fired. This was the 15th century, when cannons were still relatively new technology, unpredictable, dangerous, and prone to catastrophic failure. They were essentially metal tubes filled with gunpowder that you lit on fire and hoped for the best. Safety regulations didn't exist, neither did quality control. Cannons exploded regularly, killing their own crews. Any sane person would have observed from a distance. James wanted a front row seat. In August 1460, James was besieging Roxburgh Castle, an English-held fortress on the Scottish border. He'd brought his prized artillery, including a massive cannon he was particularly proud of. Some accounts say it was a gift from the Duke of Burgundy. Others say it was newly forged in Scotland. Either way, James was excited to test it. He ordered it loaded, positioned, and aimed at the castle walls. Then, instead of stepping back to a safe distance like his advisors probably suggested, he stood right next to it to watch it fire. The gunners lit the fuse, the cannon roared, and then it exploded. Not a small malfunction, a full catastrophic rupture. The barrel split apart, sending chunks of hot metal flying in every direction. One piece, a large fragment of iron, struck James directly in the face, or possibly the leg. Sources disagree on the exact point of impact. What they do agree on is that the king was killed instantly. No last words, no dramatic final moment. Just an explosion, a spray of blood, and a very dead monarch lying in the dirt. His soldiers were in shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. Kings died in battle, from arrows or swords, fighting gloriously. They didn't die because their own equipment blew up in their face while they stood there gawking at it like a tourist. Some soldiers reportedly thought it was an enemy attack at first, and looked around for archers. Others just stood frozen, processing the absurdity of what they'd just witnessed. Eventually someone took charge, covered the king's body, and informed the army that yes, that just happened, and no, we don't talk about it. But here's the kicker. The siege didn't stop. James's widow, Queen Mary of Guelders, was with the army. She immediately took command, rallied the troops, and ordered them to continue the siege in her husband's name. Within days, Roxburgh Castle fell to the Scots, so James technically won the siege, he just didn't live to see it. His death, while embarrassing, became a rallying cry. The Scots fought harder, fueled by anger and possibly the desire to make sure their king didn't die for nothing. Still, the death itself was absolutely preventable. James didn't need to be standing next to the cannon. He could have watched from 50 feet away and seen the same thing, but he was too excited, too eager to see his new toy in action. It's the medieval equivalent of standing directly behind a jet engine to see what it feels like. Technically impressive, definitely fatal. Cannons in the 15th century were notoriously unreliable. They were cast from bronze or iron, but metallurgy was inconsistent. Weak spots, air bubbles, and impurities meant that any cannon could explode without warning. Experienced gunners knew this and treated every firing like it might be their last. Kings apparently did not receive this memo. James II was only 29 years old when he died. He'd been a capable ruler, managing to subdue rebellious nobles and strengthen royal authority. He could have had decades more on the throne. Instead, he has the dubious honour of being one of the few monarchs killed by their own military equipment during a demonstration. Not in combat, not defending his kingdom, just standing too close during a test fire because he really wanted to see the cannon go boom. His son, James III, inherited the throne at age 8 and presumably received very stern lectures about standing back from artillery. And Scottish military engineers probably implemented some new safety protocols after that, assuming anyone survived the explosion to write them down. James II of Scotland loved cannons, trusted them completely, and learned the hard way that enthusiasm is not a substitute for distance. Albert Thurson became King of Germany in 1298, but his reign was marked by constant family drama. His nephew, John, believed he was owed part of the family inheritance. Albert disagreed. In 1308, while crossing a river, John and a group of conspirators attacked Albert and stabbed him to death. It wasn't a grand political assassination. It wasn't a battle for the throne. It was literally a family argument over money that ended with the king getting murdered in a river. John fled, was eventually caught, and was executed, but the damage was done. Albert's legacy is the king who got stabbed by his nephew over inheritance beef. Let's back up and talk about the inheritance dispute, because it's exactly as petty as it sounds. John, also known as John Parricida, which literally means John the Kinslayer, so you know how this story ends, was the son of Albert's older brother. When John's father died, he expected to inherit significant lands and titles. Albert, now king, decided that, actually, no, those lands would stay under royal control. John protested. Albert ignored him. John escalated. Albert continued ignoring him. This went on for years, festering like an infected wound, until John decided that if he couldn't have his inheritance through legal means, he'd take it by force, or at least get revenge. On May 1st, 1308, Albert was travelling from Baden to his castle at Habsburg with a small escort. They reached the Reuss River near Windisch and had to use a ferry to cross. It was a vulnerable moment, strung out in transit, guards separated by water, the king temporarily isolated. John and his conspirators, including several disgruntled nobles with their own grievances against Albert, saw their opportunity. They followed Albert onto the ferry or waited on the opposite bank, accounts vary, and as the king crossed, they struck. John personally stabbed Albert in the throat. Another conspirator, Rudolf of Wart, struck him in the back. A third attacker finished the job. Albert, King of Germany, fell into the shallow water, bleeding out, his guards too far away to help. By the time anyone reached him, he was already dying. He was carried to the riverbank where, according to some chronicles, a poor woman held his head in her lap while he bled to death. Not the most regal ending. Definitely not what you'd expect from someone who'd spent years consolidating power and fighting rival claimants. John and his co-conspirators fled immediately. They scattered across Europe, hoping to disappear before Albert's allies could organise revenge. John himself fled to Italy, then tried to hide in various monasteries and remote castles. But you can't kill a king and expect everyone to forget. Albert's son, Frederick, spent years hunting down everyone involved. The conspirators were caught one by one, and their executions were brutal. Medieval justice didn't mess around when it came to regicide, even when the regicide was technically just a really extreme family dispute. John was eventually captured in 1313, 5 years after the murder. His execution was designed to send a message. He was broken on the wheel, a torture method where executioners systematically smashed your limbs with an iron bar, then left you tied to a wagon wheel to die slowly in public view. It took hours, days, in some cases. It was meant to be horrific, a warning to anyone else considering family-based political violence. John's co-conspirators received similar treatment. None of them died well, but the damage to Albert's legacy was permanent. He'd ruled for 10 years, dealing with rebellions, rival kings, and constant political manoeuvring. He'd defeated Adolf of Nassau to claim the throne. He'd negotiated with the Pope, managed the Holy Roman Empire's complex politics, and tried to strengthen royal authority. And none of that mattered. Because when people remembered Albert Vichy, they didn't think about his policies or his victories. They thought about how he got stabbed by his nephew in a river over an inheritance dispute that could have been settled in court. It's the medieval equivalent of dying in a family feud over grandma's will. Technically tragic, but also, come on. You're the king of Germany. You rule vast territories, command armies, negotiate with popes and emperors, and you get taken out by your nephew because you wouldn't give him his dad's land? That's not epic. That's a Thanksgiving dinner argument that went way too far. Albert the Reist conquered rival kings, ruled Germany for a decade, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't a foreign army or a political rival. It's your own family at a poorly chosen river crossing, holding a grudge and a very sharp knife. Frederick the son of Denmark ruled from 1523 to 1533, and was known for being a heavy drinker. Very heavy. According to reports, Frederick drank so much beer and wine that by the end of his reign, he was basically pickled. In 1533, he attended a particularly raucous banquet, drank an unholy amount of alcohol, went to bed, and never woke up. His doctors said it was his liver. His courtiers said it was his lifestyle. Either way, Frederick died because he couldn't say no to another round. Medieval and Renaissance monarchs were expected to drink. It was part of royal culture. Banquets, diplomatic meetings, celebrations, all of them involved alcohol, usually in vast quantities. Beer at breakfast, wine at lunch, more beer in the afternoon, and enough wine at dinner to sink a small ship. But even by these excessive standards, Frederick stood out. He didn't just drink socially, he drank constantly, enthusiastically, and without apparent concern for the consequences. Courtiers described him as fond of drink, which is 16th century code for this man has a serious problem. Frederick's reign was politically complicated. He'd become king during the Protestant Reformation, and Denmark was torn between Catholic and Lutheran factions. He had to navigate religious conflicts, noble rivalries, and economic pressures. Perhaps the drinking was his way of coping. Perhaps he just really liked beer. Either way, by the early 1530s his health was clearly declining. He was overweight, often flushed, and reportedly suffered from gout, a condition exacerbated by alcohol consumption. His doctors warned him. His advisors probably warned him. He kept drinking. The final banquet took place in April 1533 at Gottorp Castle. It was a feast celebrating some political occasion. Sources aren't entirely clear on what. What is clear is that Frederick drank heavily throughout the evening. Beer, wine, probably some stronger spirits. Hour after hour, toast after toast, until he was thoroughly drunk and barely coherent. His courtiers, many of whom were also drunk, didn't stop him. Why would they? He was the king. If he wanted to drink himself into oblivion, that was his royal prerogative. Eventually, Frederick stumbled off to bed. Servants helped him get there, which tells you how far gone he was. He collapsed onto his mattress, probably still wearing most of his clothes, and passed out. The next morning, servants came to wake him. He didn't respond. They tried again. Nothing. They checked his pulse. Frederick the Fawn, King of Denmark and Norway, was dead. He was 59 years old, which wasn't ancient, but his body had clearly had enough. The doctors who examined him said his liver had failed, which is medical speak for this man drank so much that his internal organs gave up. Modern doctors would probably diagnose acute liver failure, complicated by years of chronic alcoholism. Back then, they just said he died of excessive drinking and left it at that. There was no autopsy, no detailed investigation. Everyone knew what had happened. Frederick had drunk himself to death, and the only surprise was that it hadn't happened sooner. His death triggered the usual succession crisis. His son Christian III eventually took the throne, but not before Denmark descended into civil war between Catholic and Protestant factions, a conflict that lasted 3 years and devastated the country. So Frederick's inability to moderate his drinking didn't just kill him, it destabilised an entire kingdom. Because dying suddenly, without having properly secured the succession, is exactly what you want to do as a monarch. Chroniclers of the period weren't particularly sympathetic. One wrote that Frederick was devoted to his pleasures and died as he lived. Another said he enjoyed the drink more than his duties. It's the 16th century version of writing died doing what he loved in an obituary, except what he loved was destroying his liver one tankard at a time. Here's the thing about drinking yourself to death as a king. It's slow, it's public, and everyone watches it happen. Frederick's decline wasn't a secret. His court saw him getting worse year after year. His face got redder, his belly got bigger, his temper got shorter, and his judgment got worse. But nobody could stop him because he was the king, and telling a king to put down the wine goblet is a good way to lose your position or possibly your head. Frederick III of Denmark ruled for 10 years, navigated religious upheaval, and died because he treated every night like it was the last call at a tavern. His legacy isn't his political manoeuvring or his attempts to balance Protestant and Catholic factions. It's being the king who literally could not stop drinking long enough to survive his own reign. A cautionary tale about excess liver function and the importance of occasionally saying, you know what, I've had enough for tonight. Sigurd the Mighty was a 9th century Viking earl who ruled Orkney. He was tough, brutal, and victorious in battle. In one fight he killed an enemy chieftain named Malbridert, and, as was Viking custom, tied the severed head to his saddle as a trophy. But as Sigurd rode home, the dead man's tooth scraped against his leg, causing a small cut. The cut became infected, and Sigurd died of blood poisoning. Yes, a Viking earl was killed by a dead man's tooth. Malbridert got his revenge from beyond the grave. Let's appreciate the full Viking absurdity of this situation. Sigurd the Mighty, whose name literally promised power and dominance, had just won a battle against a Scottish chieftain. In true Viking fashion, he didn't just defeat his enemy. He decapitated him, tied the severed head to his saddle by the hair, and rode off in triumph. This was normal Viking behaviour. Displaying your enemy's head was a power move, a way of saying, I won, you lost, and everyone will know it. It was intimidation, celebration, and proof of victory all rolled into one grisly trophy. But Malbridert, even in death, had one final trick. The chronicles describe him as having prominent teeth, possibly buck teeth, maybe just unusually large in sizes. Either way, as Sigurd rode, the head bounced against his leg with each step of the horse, and one of those teeth, sharp and protruding, scraped against Sigurd's calf. Just a small scratch, barely noticeable. The kind of minor injury you'd ignore in favour of celebrating your victory. Sigurd probably didn't even feel it at first. But this was the 9th century. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of germ theory. Every cut, every scrape, every open wound was a potential death sentence. And a scratch from a dead man's tooth? That's about as unsanitary as it gets. The head had been bouncing around in the dirt, exposed to bacteria, decay, and who knows what else. That tooth was basically a biological weapon. Within days, the cut became inflamed, then infected. Sigurd's leg swelled, turned red, and began to suppurate, which is medieval speak for leaking pus in alarming quantities. He developed a fever. The infection spread through his bloodstream. In modern terms, he had septicemia, blood poisoning, caused by bacteria entering his body through the cut. In Viking terms, Malbridt's spirit was getting revenge. Either way, Sigurd was dying and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The irony was not lost on anyone. Sigurd the Mighty, feared warrior, conqueror of enemies, brought down not by a sword or an arrow, but by a scratch from a dead man's tooth. It's the kind of death that sounds like divine punishment or cosmic justice. The saga of the Earls of Orkney, written centuries later, treats it almost like a morality tale. Don't disrespect your enemies, even in death, because sometimes they bite back, literally. Sigurd's death left Orkney in chaos. He had no clear heir ready to take over, which meant political instability, rival claimants, and probably a few more violent power struggles. All because their earl couldn't resist the urge to tie a severed head to his saddle and didn't notice when it gave him a tiny scratch. Modern historians love this story because it's so perfectly absurdly Viking. It combines martial prowess, brutal customs, and an unexpected twist that feels almost comedic. But it's also a reminder of how fragile life was in the medieval period. You could be the mightiest warrior in the north, feared by enemies and respected by allies, and still die from a minor infection that today would be treated with a band-aid and some neosporin. There's also something poetic about it. Maelbricta lost the battle, lost his life, lost his head, but in death he won. His tooth, probably the last part of him still capable of causing harm, struck the final blow. Sigurd rode home victorious with a trophy, and the trophy killed him. Its revenge served cold, literally from beyond the grave. The Vikings told and retold this story for generations. It became a legend, a cautionary tale, and probably a drinking song. Remember Sigurd the Mighty, who died from a dead man's bite. It's the kind of story that makes you think twice before strapping body parts to your saddle, no matter how impressive it looks. Sigurd the Mighty conquered enemies, ruled Orkney, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous part of your victory is the trophy itself. Watch out for teeth. Louis III co-ruled France with his brother in the late 9th century. His reign was short and mostly uneventful until 882, when he saw a pretty girl and decided to chase her, on horseback, through a town, at full speed. The girl ran into a building. Louis, not thinking clearly, followed her. Unfortunately, he didn't notice the low wooden beam across the doorway. He rode straight into it, cracked his skull, and died shortly after. Louis III's legacy: died chasing a girl and forgetting to duck. Let's set the scene. Louis III is young, probably in his late teens or early 20s. He's recently won a significant battle against Viking invaders, so he's feeling pretty good about himself. Confident. Maybe overconfident. He's riding through a town, possibly with his entourage, possibly alone, when he spots a young woman. Chronicles describe her as beautiful, though medieval chroniclers called every woman involved in a king's embarrassing death beautiful. So who knows? Either way, Louis is interested. Now, a normal person would perhaps slow down, dismount and attempt a conversation. Maybe send a servant with a message. Use some kind of courtly etiquette. Louis III, however, decides that the best approach is to chase her on horseback through the town streets. Not a gentle trot, a full gallop. Because nothing says romance like a king bearing down on you at high speed while you're trying to go about your day. The girl, understandably terrified, runs. Maybe she thinks he's attacking her. Maybe she knows exactly who he is and wants nothing to do with him. Either way, she flees into the nearest building, probably her home or a shop, seeking safety. Louis, completely committed to this terrible plan, spurs his horse forward and follows her through the doorway, without slowing down, without looking up, without considering that buildings have door frames and door frames are lower than open air. There's a wooden beam across the entrance, a standard architectural feature in 9th century buildings. It's there for structural support to hold up the upper floor or the roof. Louis doesn't see it, or he sees it and doesn't process it in time. Either way, he rides directly into it at full speed. The impact is catastrophic. His forehead strikes the beam with enough force to crack his skull. He's thrown backward off his horse, lands hard on the ground, and that's it. The King of France, co-ruler of the realm, victor over Vikings, taken out by a wooden beam because he couldn't control himself around a pretty face. He doesn't die immediately, which somehow makes it worse. He's carried back to his residence, unconscious or semi-conscious, with a massive head injury. Doctors are summoned. They do what medieval doctors do, which is essentially nothing useful. Bloodletting, prayers, maybe some herbal poultices. None of it works. Louis lingers for a day or two, then dies. He was probably around 18 or 19 years old. His reign lasted less than 3 years. The chroniclers who recorded this event tried to make it sound more dignified than it was. Some versions say Louis was pursuing an enemy, or chasing a fugitive. But the most widely repeated version, the one that stuck, says he was chasing a girl he found attractive. And honestly, that version makes more sense. If he'd been chasing an enemy, his guards would have been with him. If it were official business, there'd be witnesses and a proper record. The fact that he was alone, riding recklessly through a town, suggests this was personal, impulsive, and incredibly stupid. His brother Carloman Sauer inherited sole rule of France, and probably spent the rest of his life telling people, "No, really, that's how my brother died," and watching them struggle not to laugh. Because it's objectively ridiculous. You're a king. You have power, wealth, and literally any other way to meet women, and you die because you chased one through a doorway without looking where you were going? The story became a cautionary tale, though what exactly it's cautioning against depends on who's telling it. Some say it's about lust and loss of self-control. Others say it's about the dangers of not paying attention to your surroundings. Practical minds say it's about the importance of ducking when riding through doorways, which seems obvious but apparently needed to be stated. Louis III had actually been a decent king up to that point. He'd defeated a major Viking invasion at the Battle of Secours-en-Vimeux, a significant victory that temporarily saved northern France from raids. Poets wrote songs about his bravery. Nobles respected him. He was young, capable, and had a promising future. And then he threw it all away chasing a girl he'd probably never even spoken to, riding his horse into architecture, and proving that crowns don't protect you from terrible decisions. Louis III of France won battles, defended his kingdom, and died doing something so monumentally dumb that 100 years later, people are still shaking their heads. The lesson? It doesn't matter how many Vikings you defeat if you can't defeat your own impulsiveness, and always, always duck. Humbert III ruled Savoy from 1148 to 1189, but he didn't really want to. He wanted to be a monk, so he abdicated, joined a monastery, and tried to live a quiet life of prayer. But his nobles dragged him back to the throne because apparently he was the only option. Humbert tried to abdicate again, and again, and again. He spent his entire reign trying to quit being king, failing every time and dying in 1189, still technically on the throne. Not embarrassing in the traditional sense, but definitely awkward. Imagine being so bad at quitting your job that you try multiple times over 4 decades and still can't manage it. That was Humbert III's life. He became Count of Savoy at age 16 when his father died, and almost immediately he hated it. The politics, the warfare, the constant decision-making, the pressure, none of it appealed to him. What appealed to him was prayer, solitude, and the quiet contemplative life of a monastery. So in his early 20s, Humbert made an announcement. He was abdicating. He was done. Someone else could rule. He was going to become a monk. His nobles were horrified. You can't just quit being a count. That's not how medieval politics works. You're born into power, you rule until you die, and then your heir takes over. You don't get to retire to pursue your passion for silent prayer. The nobles refused to accept his abdication. They showed up at the monastery, possibly with armed guards, and politely but firmly informed Humbert that he was coming back to Savoy whether he liked it or not. He was the legitimate ruler, he had responsibilities, and they weren't going to let him hide behind monastery walls. Humbert, being a genuinely pious and non-confrontational person, agreed. He returned to the throne, resumed his duties, and was miserable. So a few years later, he tried again. Same process. Announced his abdication, joined a monastery, started his monastic life. And once again the nobles came and dragged him back. This pattern repeated multiple times throughout his reign. Historians aren't exactly sure how many times Humbert attempted to abdicate, but it was at least 3 or 4, possibly more. Each time he was talked out of it, guilt-tripped, or outright forced to return. The problem was that Humbert was actually a decent ruler when he bothered to do the job. He was pious, fair, and generally well liked. He founded hospitals, supported religious institutions, and tried to govern justly. But his heart wasn't in it. He'd rather be praying in a cold stone cell than sitting on a throne making decisions about taxes and territorial disputes. He was the medieval equivalent of someone who's great at their job, but dreams of quitting to open a pottery studio in the countryside. His nobles, meanwhile, were stuck in an impossible position. They needed a stable ruler, and Humber was it. His heirs were either too young, incompetent, or non-existent at various points. So every time Humbert tried to leave, they had to convince him to stay. It became a running joke in European courts. "Oh, Humbert abdicated again? Give it a month, he'll be back." What makes this especially awkward is that Humbert was deeply, genuinely religious. This wasn't a ploy for attention, or a political manoeuvre. He truly believed his calling was to serve God in a monastery, not to rule a territory. But every time he tried to follow that calling, his earthly responsibilities dragged him back. It's almost tragic, if it weren't also kind of funny. Here's a man with absolute power who desperately doesn't want it, and yet he can't escape it. His personal life didn't help. Humbert married twice, and both marriages were reportedly unhappy. He had heirs, but they caused their own problems. His son died young. His succession was constantly in question. And through it all, Humbert just wanted to leave, to find peace in monastic life, and kept failing. By the time Humbert died in the 1189 at age 57, he was still Count of Savoy. He never successfully escaped the throne. He died ruling, which was exactly what he'd spent 40 years trying not to do. The Church, recognising his piety and his genuine desire to serve God, eventually beatified him. So technically, Humbert got the last laugh. He became Blessed Humber, venerated for his holiness. But in life, he was the king who couldn't quit, no matter how hard he tried. His legacy is strange. He wasn't a bad ruler. He wasn't cruel or incompetent. He was just profoundly, desperately unsuited for the job he was born into. And medieval society offered no way out. You couldn't resign from being a count. You couldn't retire. You were stuck until death, whether you wanted it or not. Humbert III of Savoy ruled for over 40 years, tried to quit at least 4 times, failed every time, and proved that sometimes the most embarrassing thing isn't dying badly, it's being unable to leave a job you hate, even when you're literally the boss. Conrad III ruled Germany from 1138 to 1152, but he was never actually crowned Holy Roman Emperor because he couldn't make it to Rome. Every time he tried, something went wrong. Wars, rebellions, bad weather, political disputes. He spent his entire reign technically being king of the Romans, but never officially emperor. It's like being hired for a job but never getting your first paycheck. Conrad died in 1152, still waiting for his coronation. Historians mostly just feel bad for him. Let's be clear about what this meant. In the Holy Roman Empire, becoming king of the Romans was step 1. You were elected by German princes, crowned in Germany, and given authority over German territories. But to become Holy Roman Emperor, the big title, the one with real legitimacy and prestige, you had to travel to Rome and be crowned by the Pope. That was the rule. No papal coronation, no emperor title. Conrad managed step 1 just fine. Step 2? Complete disaster. Conrad's problem started immediately. He was elected in 1138, beating out his rival, and should have been able to march to Rome for his coronation within a year or 2. But Germany was a mess. His rival, Henry the Proud, refused to accept the election results and started a civil war. Conrad spent years fighting rebellions, putting down uprisings, and trying to consolidate power. Every time he thought about heading to Rome, another crisis erupted. A castle rebelled, a duke switched sides, a neighbouring kingdom attacked. Conrad couldn't leave Germany because if he did, his throne would collapse behind him. Then there was the Second Crusade. In 1147, Pope Eugene III called for a crusade to recapture territory lost to Muslim forces. Conrad, being a pious Christian king and also desperately wanting to get on the Pope's good side so he could finally get crowned, agreed to lead the German forces. Surely, he thought, this would earn him enough favour that the Pope would crown him as soon as he returned. The crusade was a disaster. Conrad's army was ambushed in Anatolia, decimated by the Turks and forced to retreat. He returned to Germany in 1149, humiliated, broke, and still not emperor. He tried again in the early 1150s. He made plans, gathered resources, and prepared to finally make the journey to Rome. And then Italy descended into chaos. The Pope was fighting with the Roman Senate. The Normans in southern Italy were causing trouble. Northern Italian cities were rebelling against imperial authority. Rome itself was basically a war zone. The Pope sent word to Conrad, "Now is not a good time. Maybe wait a bit." Conrad waited, and kept waiting. Meanwhile, he was technically ruling as King of the Romans, which sounds impressive but was basically a placeholder title. Everyone knew he wasn't really the emperor. Foreign rulers treated him with less respect. His own nobles questioned his authority. Diplomatic letters addressed him with the lesser title, which was a constant reminder of his incomplete status. It's the medieval equivalent of having acting manager on your business card for 15 years. Conrad's health started failing in his early 50s. He'd spent his entire reign at war, under stress, constantly managing crises. In 1152, he became seriously ill. He knew he was dying, and in his final days, one of his biggest regrets, recorded by chroniclers, was that he'd never been crowned emperor. He'd ruled Germany for 14 years, fought wars, led a crusade, and managed one of the most complex political entities in medieval Europe. But he'd never received the one thing that would have legitimized it all: the papal coronation, the official recognition, the title he'd worked toward his entire reign. He died in February 1152, still King of the Romans, never Holy Roman Emperor. His nephew Frederick Barbarossa succeeded him, and, in a twist of cosmic irony, made it to Rome and got crowned emperor within 3 years. Frederick did everything Conrad had tried to do and succeeded where Conrad had failed. It must have been frustrating for Conrad's ghost, if ghosts can be frustrated. Here's what makes Conrad's story more sad than embarrassing. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't a bad ruler. He just had spectacularly bad timing and even worse luck. Every time the path to Rome cleared, something new blocked it. Rebellions, crusades, Italian politics, papal disputes, his own failing health. He was trapped in a perfect storm of medieval bureaucracy and political chaos, unable to complete the one ceremonial task that would have secured his legacy. Historians do feel bad for Conrad. He's remembered as the king who never quite made it, who spent 14 years reaching for something just out of his grasp. Not because he was unworthy, but because the universe kept moving the goalposts. Conrad III of Germany ruled an empire, fought wars, led crusades, and died still waiting for the job title he'd technically earned over a decade earlier. Sometimes history's most embarrassing moments aren't dramatic failures. They're just bureaucratic nightmares that never end. Louis XVI is famous for being beheaded during the French Revolution, but what's less known is how incredibly awkward and ineffective he was as a king. Louis loved making locks, actual locks. He was obsessed with locksmithing and spent hours in his workshop tinkering with mechanisms while his kingdom fell apart. He was shy, indecisive, and reportedly took 7 years to consummate his marriage to Marie Antoinette because he didn't understand how sex worked. When revolutionaries stormed Versailles, Louis's response was basically, "Oh no, anyway," and then he got arrested. Embarrassing from start to finish. Let's start with the locks. Louis XVI had a fully equipped locksmith workshop at Versailles. Not a hobby corner, a professional-grade workshop with tools, materials, and a master locksmith who taught him the craft. Louis would spend entire afternoons there, filing metal, designing keys, and creating intricate locking mechanisms while France's economy collapsed, the nobility schemed, and his ministers begged for decisions on literally anything. Imagine being a French official trying to get the king to sign off on urgent financial reforms. And his secretary tells you, His Majesty is busy with his locks right now. Perhaps try again tomorrow. This wasn't occasional tinkering. This was obsessive escapism. Louis used locksmithing to avoid the responsibilities he was terrified of handling. He was shy, socially awkward, and completely unprepared for kingship. He'd been raised as a spare heir, never expecting to become king, but when his older brother died, Louis was suddenly thrust into the role, and he hated it, every minute of it. So he retreated to his workshop where problems had solutions, where mechanisms worked predictably, and where nobody expected him to make life or death decisions about taxation or war. Then there's the marriage situation. Louis married Marie Antoinette in 1770 when he was 15 and she was 14. Standard royal marriage, arranged for political alliance. Except Louis didn't consummate it, for 7 years. This became an international scandal. Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, wrote increasingly frantic letters asking what was wrong. Diplomats whispered, courtiers gossiped. The marriage needed an heir, and 7 years in there was no heir and apparently no attempt at one. The problem, according to some historians, was that Louis had a minor physical condition that made intercourse painful, possibly phimosis, which could have been corrected with a simple procedure. Other historians think he was just clueless, that nobody had properly explained sex to him, and he was too shy and awkward to figure it out. Eventually, Marie Antoinette's brother, Emperor Joseph II, visited and apparently had a very direct conversation with Louis about the mechanics of marital relations. Shortly after, the marriage was finally consummated and Marie Antoinette became pregnant. So yes, it took the intervention of his brother-in-law to explain sex to the King of France. Louis's indecisiveness defined his reign. When France's financial crisis deepened, he couldn't choose between competing reform proposals. When the Estates General met in 1789 for the first time in over a century, he couldn't control it. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, he sort of objected but didn't really enforce anything. When revolutionaries marched on Versailles in October 1789, demanding bread and the king's presence in Paris, Louis just went along with it. He was moved to Paris, essentially held captive, and his response was polite compliance. Even his diary entries are painfully awkward. On July 14th, 1789, the day the Bastille was stormed, a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of the revolution's violent phase, Louis wrote in his diary, rien. Nothing. Because nothing important happened to him that day. He went hunting, didn't catch anything, so he wrote nothing. While Paris burned and his kingdom transformed, Louis was concerned about his unsuccessful hunting trip. When the royal family tried to escape France in 1791, the famous flight to Varennes, they were caught because Louis insisted on travelling in a large, luxurious carriage that moved slowly and attracted attention. His advisors had suggested disguises and speed. Louis wanted comfort. They were recognised, arrested and brought back to Paris in humiliation. Louis had literally been given a chance to escape and potentially save his family, and he blew it because he couldn't travel without proper cushions. Throughout his imprisonment and trial, Louis maintained an almost surreal passivity. He was polite to his captors, cooperative during his trial, and seemingly resigned to whatever fate awaited him. When he was sentenced to death, he accepted it calmly. On January 21st, 1793, he was guillotined in front of a massive crowd. His final words, attempting to address the crowd, were cut short when the drums drowned him out. Louis XVI wasn't evil or cruel. He was just catastrophically unsuited for kingship. He was a man who loved locks and hunting, who wanted a quiet life, who never asked to rule France, and who completely collapsed under the pressure when crisis came. He's remembered not for any great achievements, but for being the king who fiddled with locks while Paris burned, who couldn't figure out basic human biology for 7 years, and who passively accepted revolution, arrest, and execution because making a decision, any decision, was simply too hard. Louis XVI, proof that even absolute power is useless if you're too awkward to use it. Erik the Throntive ruled Sweden from 1560 to 1568, but his reign was marked by paranoia, instability, and eventual imprisonment. In 1577, while locked up by his brother, Erik was served a bowl of pea soup. It was poisoned with arsenic. He ate it and died. Some say his brother ordered the poisoning, others say it was a guard acting on his own. Either way, Erik's final meal was toxic pea soup, and his legacy is the king who died eating peasant food in prison. Erik the Throntive started his reign with promise. He was intelligent, cultured, and interested in arts and sciences. He spoke multiple languages, composed music, and genuinely tried to modernise Sweden. But he also inherited his father's paranoia and mental instability, and over time these traits completely consumed him. By the mid-1560s, Erik was convinced that everyone was plotting against him. His nobles, his advisors, even his own family. and in some cases he was right. But his response to real and imagined threats was so extreme that it destroyed his reign. In 1567, Eric's paranoia reached its peak. He became convinced that several noble families were conspiring to overthrow him. He had them arrested, and in a fit of rage personally participated in their executions. This wasn't a calculated political purge. This was a king losing control, stabbing prisoners himself in a dungeon, covered in blood, screaming about traitors. His actions horrified the Swedish nobility and gave his brothers the justification they needed to act against him. In 1568, Eric's brother John, Duke of Finland, led a rebellion. Eric's support collapsed almost immediately. Nobody wanted to defend a paranoid, violent king who might murder them next. Eric was captured, deposed, and imprisoned. John became King John III, and Eric became a problem that needed managing. For 9 years, Eric was moved from castle to castle, kept under guard, his living conditions gradually deteriorating. He went from a comfortable captivity to something much grimmer. By 1577, Eric had been locked up for nearly a decade. He was isolated, probably mentally ill, certainly depressed. He posed no real threat anymore, but he was still alive, and as long as he lived, he was a potential rallying point for anyone unhappy with John III's rule. Dead kings can't be used in rebellions. Living ones, even imprisoned ones, can. So someone made a decision. On February 26, 1577, Eric was served a bowl of pea soup. Pea soup, soppa in Swedish, was basic peasant food, cheap and filling. It was probably the standard prison meal, nothing special. But this particular bowl had been doctored with arsenic. Eric ate it. Within hours, he was violently ill. Vomiting, cramping, the classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning. He died the next day, February 26th, at age 43. The question of who ordered the poisoning remains disputed. Some historians believe John III gave the order, deciding his brother had become too much of a liability. Others think it was carried out by a guard or prison official, acting on their own initiative, or possibly on subtle instructions that left John plausible deniability. There was no investigation, no trial. Eric died, was buried quietly, and John III continued ruling without interruption. Convenient. What makes Eric's death especially pathetic is the method. Poisoned pea soup. The King of Sweden, once powerful and feared, reduced to eating peasant food in a cell, and that peasant food killed him. It's the culinary equivalent of adding insult to fatal injury. Not a dramatic assassination, not a public execution, just a bowl of soup that happened to be toxic, served to a forgotten prisoner who'd once worn a crown. Pea soup remained a staple of Swedish cuisine. Traditionally eaten on Thursdays. To this day, Swedes joke darkly about Erik IV whenever ärtsoppa is served. Don't worry, this batch isn't poisoned, probably. It's the kind of historical trauma that gets processed through dark humour centuries later. Eric's mental decline and violent paranoia were tragic. He wasn't an evil person. He was an unstable one who never should have been given absolute power. His reign started with art and culture and ended with murder and madness, and his death, quiet and inglorious in a prison cell, poisoned by something as mundane as soup, somehow feels fitting for a man whose life spiralled from greatness into complete collapse. Modern historians debate whether Eric suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or some other condition that 16th century medicine couldn't understand or treat. Whatever it was, it destroyed him and his kingdom's stability. His brother John III ruled for years afterward, but the succession crisis Eric's deposition created would haunt Sweden for decades. Erik XIV of Sweden began as a Renaissance prince, descended into paranoid tyranny, and died in prison from arsenic-laced peasant food. His legacy isn't his cultural achievements or his early reforms. It's being the king who was literally too dangerous to keep alive and too inconvenient to let live, solved with a bowl of soup and a dose of poison. Sometimes the most embarrassing deaths aren't dramatic. They're just quietly tragic, served in a wooden bowl on a Thursday afternoon. Alexander I ruled Scotland from 1107 to 1124 and was generally a competent king. But in 1124, he and several courtiers were caught in a storm while travelling by ship. The ship wrecked. and Alexander personally helped rescue people from the freezing water. He succeeded, everyone survived, and Alexander was hailed as a hero. Then he caught pneumonia from the freezing water and died a few days later. So yes, he died being heroic, but also he died because he got wet. Alexander the Fun, nicknamed the Fierce for his military prowess and stern demeanour, was crossing the Firth of Forth in April 1124. This was standard travel for a Scottish king. The Firth connected different parts of his kingdom, and ships were the most practical way to move between them. But Scottish weather in April is unpredictable, to put it mildly. 1 minute calm waters, the next a storm that makes you regret every decision that led you to being on a boat. The storm hit without much warning. Waves swelled, wind howled, and the ship, not built for rough weather, began taking on water. Panic spread among the passengers. Courtiers, nobles, servants, all scrambling as the ship listed dangerously. Some chronicles say the ship partially capsized. Others say it ran aground on rocks. Either way, people were in the water, freezing cold Scottish water in April, which is only slightly less deadly than Scottish water in January. Alexander, instead of prioritising his own escape like a sensible monarch, started pulling people out of the water. One by one, he grabbed flailing courtiers and hauled them to safety, either onto the wreckage or to shore, depending on which account you read. He was soaked to the bone, freezing, exhausted, but he kept going until everyone was accounted for. No casualties, everyone survived, Alexander was a hero, and then he started coughing. By the time they reached land and got to shelter, Alexander was shivering uncontrollably. His clothes were drenched, his body temperature had plummeted, and he'd been in freezing water for long enough to do serious damage. Medieval Scotland didn't have heated blankets, hot showers, or antibiotics. They had fire, wool blankets, and hope. Alexander was wrapped in whatever dry cloth they could find, placed near a fire, and probably given warm ale or broth. It wasn't enough. Within days, Alexander developed pneumonia. His lungs filled with fluid, his breathing became laboured, and fever set in. Medieval doctors tried their standard treatments, bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers, none of which help with bacterial pneumonia. Alexander's condition worsened rapidly. He was a strong man, a warrior king, but his immune system couldn't fight off an infection that today would be treated with a Z-Pack and rest. On April 23, 1124, less than a week after the shipwreck, Alexander the Rose died. He was around 44 years old. The tragedy is that Alexander did everything right. He acted selflessly, saved lives, and prevented what could have been a disaster that killed multiple nobles and destabilised Scotland. He was genuinely heroic. But heroism doesn't protect you from hypothermia and bacterial infections. His courtiers survived because of him. He died because of the same freezing water that nearly killed them. Scottish nobles were devastated, not just because they'd lost their king, but because of how unnecessary it felt. If Alexander had prioritised his own safety, let others do the rescuing, or even just gotten out of the water faster, he might have survived. But that wasn't his nature. He was called the Fierce for a reason. Fierce in battle, fierce in loyalty, and apparently fierce in his determination to save his people, even at the cost of his own life. Chronicles from the period praised Alexander's bravery, but also noted the bitter irony. One account said he died a hero's death, though not in battle. Another described his final days as suffering brought by his own nobility of spirit. Medieval writers understood the tragedy, a good king doing the right thing and dying because of it. What makes this embarrassing isn't Alexander's actions. It's the cause of death. Died rescuing people from a shipwreck sounds noble. Died from pneumonia after getting wet sounds like something that could have been avoided with a good towel and some vitamin C. The gap between the heroic deed and the mundane medical consequence is almost comical, if it weren't so sad. Modern doctors would say, Alexander died from aspiration pneumonia complicated by hypothermia and exhaustion. He probably inhaled water during the rescue, his body temperature dropped dangerously low, and his immune system was compromised by physical stress. Once infection set in, there was no stopping it. In 1124, pneumonia was a death sentence, especially for someone who'd been through what Alexander had. His death left Scotland without a clear succession plan. His brother David eventually took the throne, but the transition was messy and caused political instability. So Alexander's heroic death didn't just cost him his life, it destabilised the kingdom he'd worked to strengthen. Alexander I of Scotland ruled for 17 years, fought battles, built churches, strengthened royal authority, and died because he was too brave for his own good. He saved everyone on that ship and paid for it with his life. It's not embarrassing in the traditional sense, but it's definitely frustrating. Sometimes doing the right thing kills you, and there's no amount of hindsight that makes that feel fair. Alexander the Fierce, hero, king, and proof that even noble deaths can feel preventable in retrospect. Ferdinand the Hun ruled Portugal from 1367 to 1383 and had a talent for making terrible romantic decisions. He was supposed to marry a Spanish princess for a political alliance. Instead, he fell in love with a married noblewoman, kidnapped her, forced her husband into exile, and married her himself. This destroyed Portugal's relationship with Spain and plunged the kingdom into war. Ferdinand spent the rest of his reign desperately trying to fix the diplomatic disaster he'd created by thinking with his heart and other parts instead of his brain. Let's set the stage. Ferdinand becomes king at age 22. Portugal needs allies, specifically an alliance with Castile, the most powerful kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula. The solution is obvious. Marry a Castilian princess, secure the alliance, ensure peace and prosperity. Simple, medieval politics. Ferdinand's advisors have already arranged everything. The princess is available, the terms are negotiated, everyone's ready to sign. All Ferdinand has to do is show up, say, "I do," and secure Portugal's future. But then Ferdinand meets Leonor Teles de Menezes. She's beautiful, charming, intelligent, and married. Very married. To a Portuguese nobleman named Juan Lourenço da Cunha. This should have been a deal-breaker, but Ferdinand, young and impulsive and clearly not thinking with his crown, decides he doesn't care. He wants Leonor. He pursues her openly, scandalously. Court gossip erupts. His advisors panic. The Castilian princess and her family are insulted. The diplomatic arrangement collapses, and Ferdinand doesn't stop. In 1371, he escalates dramatically. He has Leonor's marriage to João annulled on questionable grounds, forces João into exile, and marries Leonor himself. It's a royal scandal of epic proportions. Leonor wasn't even technically divorced when they married. The annulment was rushed through by compliant church officials. The Portuguese nobility were outraged. Castile was furious, and Ferdinand, besotted and defiant, declared that he'd married for love and everyone else could deal with it. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. King Henry II of Castile, deeply offended by the snub to his family and suspicious of Ferdinand's intentions, invaded Portugal in 1369, then again in 1371, and again in 1372. Ferdinand found himself fighting 3 separate wars against Castile, a kingdom with far more resources, larger armies, and a very personal grudge. Each time Portugal barely survived, forced to sign humiliating treaties and give up territory just to make the fighting stop. Ferdinand tried everything to recover. He switched alliances, courting England and forming an alliance through his daughter Beatrice's marriage to King John IV of Castile, ironically the same kingdom he'd enraged years earlier. But the damage was done. Portugal's position was weakened, its treasury drained from constant warfare, and its nobility resentful. All because Ferdinand couldn't resist a married woman, and Leonor herself? She became one of the most hated queens in Portuguese history. The people blamed her for the wars, calling her a manipulator and a homewrecker. Whether that's fair is debatable. Ferdinand made his own choices, but public opinion didn't care about nuance. She was seen as the woman who'd seduced the king and ruined the kingdom. Chroniclers described her as cunning and ambitious, which may be code for she had agency and people didn't like it. Ferdinand's reign became defined by desperate diplomacy. He flip-flopped between alliances with Castile and England, trying to play them against each other and failing spectacularly at both. He signed treaties he couldn't uphold, made promises he couldn't keep, and watched Portugal's international reputation crumble. His nobles lost faith in him, his people suffered through wars they didn't want, and through it all, Ferdinand remained married to Leonor, apparently genuinely in love, which almost makes it more frustrating. When Ferdinand died in 1383 at age 38, probably from plague though sources aren't certain, he left behind a succession crisis. His only legitimate heir was his daughter Beatrice, who was married to the King of Castile. This meant that if Beatrice inherited, Portugal would effectively fall under Castilian control, the exact thing Ferdinand's arranged marriage decades earlier was supposed to prevent. The Portuguese nobility rebelled, civil war erupted, and Portugal spent years fighting to maintain independence. All of this traced back to Ferdinand's impulsive decision to marry for love instead of politics. Here's the thing, marrying for love wasn't inherently wrong, but when you're a king, your marriage isn't personal. It's a political tool, a diplomatic instrument. Ferdinand treated it like a personal choice, and his kingdom paid the price in blood, gold, and stability. He wasn't cruel or incompetent in other areas. He genuinely tried to fix his mistakes. But some mistakes are too big to fix, especially when they involve insulting your most powerful neighbour and destabilising your own succession. Ferdinand Wren of Portugal ruled for 16 years, fell in love with the wrong woman, kidnapped her from her husband, married her anyway, triggered multiple wars, bankrupted his kingdom, and died leaving behind a succession crisis that nearly destroyed Portuguese independence. His legacy isn't his administrative reforms or his building projects. It's being the king who chose passion over pragmatism and watched his kingdom burn for it. Proof that sometimes following your heart means your kingdom follows you straight into disaster. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, was so inbred that he could barely function. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were cousins. His family tree looked like a wreath. As a result, Charles had a jaw so misaligned, he couldn't chew food properly, a tongue so large he drooled constantly and was likely infertile. He couldn't produce an heir, which meant when he died in 1700, the Spanish throne passed to a completely different family and triggered the War of Spanish Succession. Charles's legacy, being so genetically compromised that his death started a war. The Habsburg dynasty had been intermarrying for generations to keep power, wealth, and titles within the family. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The same handful of bloodlines recycled through the royal family tree again and again. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. Modern genetic analysis estimates he was more inbred than the offspring of a brother-sister pairing. His family tree didn't branch, it was a tangle of loops. The results were catastrophic. Charles was born with severe physical and mental disabilities. The infamous Habsburg jaw, technically mandibular prognathism, was so pronounced that his lower jaw jutted out far beyond his upper jaw. He couldn't close his mouth properly, couldn't chew food, and had to eat liquid or semi-liquid meals his entire life. His tongue was so large and swollen that speech was difficult, slurred, and often incomprehensible. Courtiers had trouble understanding their own king. He didn't walk until age 4. He didn't speak clearly until age 8. He suffered from frequent illnesses, seizures, and what were probably episodes of severe depression or other mental health issues that 17th century medicine couldn't diagnose. He was physically weak, short for his age, and described by contemporaries as having the appearance of an old man, even as a child. His own mother reportedly referred to him as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before he was 35. But the most politically disastrous issue was his infertility. Charles married twice, first to Marie Louise of Orleans, and then, after her death, to Maria Anna of Palatinate-Neuburg. Both marriages were political necessities, desperate attempts to produce an heir and continue the Habsburg line. Neither produced children. Charles tried, both queens tried, doctors, priests, and advisors all tried to help. Nothing worked. Modern historians believe Charles was likely sterile due to his genetic conditions, though at the time, everyone blamed witchcraft, curses, or the queens themselves. His reign was a disaster of incompetence, not because Charles was malicious, but because he was incapable. He couldn't make decisions. He couldn't understand complex politics. He relied entirely on advisors and courtiers who manipulated him constantly, using him as a puppet to advance their own agendas. Spain, once the most powerful empire in Europe, declined rapidly under his rule. Territories were lost, the economy collapsed, and the military weakened. The Spanish court became a joke across Europe. As Charles aged, his health worsened. By his 30s, he was prematurely senile, suffering from what were probably symptoms of severe genetic disorders. He had digestive problems, likely due to his jaw malformation. He suffered from edema, swelling in his legs and feet. He was bedridden for long periods, and through it all, the question loomed: who would inherit Spain when he died? Because Charles had no children, the succession was wide open. Multiple European powers had claims or ambitions. The French Bourbons, the Austrian Habsburgs, and various other dynasties all circled like vultures. Charles, barely able to govern himself, was pressured from all sides to name an heir. Different factions at court pushed different candidates, forging documents and manipulating the dying king. In his final years, Charles was essentially held hostage in his own palace, while Europe prepared for the inevitable war over his throne. He died on November 1st, 1700, at age 38, though he looked and functioned like a man in his 70s. His autopsy, recorded in disturbing detail, described a body that had essentially failed in every way. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied, his head was full of water, one testicle was black. The court physician wrote that he did not contain a single drop of blood. Whether this was exaggeration or genuine medical observation, it painted a picture of a man whose body had been destroyed by generations of genetic damage. And then came the war. Charles's will named Philip of Anjou, a French prince, as his successor. Austria immediately contested, claiming their own Habsburg candidate. England, the Dutch Republic, and various German states all took sides based on who they feared more, a French-controlled Spain or an Austrian one. The War of Spanish Succession lasted 13 years, killed hundreds of thousands, and redrew the map of Europe. All because the Habsburgs had spent centuries marrying each other and produced a king so genetically compromised that his death was inevitable, and his succession impossible. Charles II of Spain lived in constant pain, ruled in name only, couldn't produce an heir despite 2 marriages, and died so catastrophically that Europe went to war over who got his throne. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't evil, he was just the final tragic result of a dynasty that valued bloodline purity over basic biology. His legacy is a warning written in genetic code. Some family trees need to branch out, or they'll collapse entirely. Attila the Hun wasn't technically a king in the medieval European sense, but he was one of history's most feared rulers, so terrifying that Romans called him the Scourge of God. He conquered half of Europe, destroyed entire armies, and made emperors tremble at the mere mention of his name. Cities surrendered before he even arrived. His reputation was built on blood, fire, and absolute dominance. And then, in 453 CE, on his wedding night to a young woman named Ildiko, Attila the Hun, the man who had humiliated Rome itself, died from a nosebleed. Not in battle, not from an assassin's blade, a nosebleed. According to historical accounts, Attila had been drinking heavily during the wedding feast, as one does when you're a warlord marrying yet another bride. He went to bed, passed out drunk, and at some point during the night, his nose started bleeding. Normally, not a big deal. You wake up, pinch your nose, tilt your head back, maybe grab a cloth. But Attila was so drunk he didn't wake up. The blood ran down his throat, he choked, and he drowned in his own blood while unconscious. His new bride woke up next to his corpse. Imagine being Ildiko. You just married the most feared man in the world, and by morning, he's dead in bed next to you from a nosebleed. Naturally, everyone assumed she'd murdered him. She was interrogated, possibly tortured, but eventually cleared because the evidence pointed to the most embarrassing truth possible. Attila, the unstoppable conqueror, had been killed by his own nose and too much wine. Let's back up and appreciate who Attila was. This wasn't some minor chieftain. This was the leader of the Hunnic Empire, a confederation of tribes that terrorized Europe for decades. Attila had invaded the Eastern Roman Empire multiple times, extracting massive tribute payments. He'd marched into Gaul and nearly conquered it, before being stopped at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. He'd invaded Italy, and cities fell before him like dominoes. Pope Leo the Fun personally negotiated with him to spare Rome. Emperors paid him gold just to stay away. He was 5th century Europe's nightmare, the barbarian king who made civilization itself tremble. And he died drunk in bed from a nosebleed on his wedding night. The irony is so perfect it almost seems fictional. But multiple sources, including the Roman historian Priscus and the Gothic historian Jordanus, confirm the basic story. Attila celebrated his marriage to Ildiko with an epic feast. Wine flowed freely. Attila, never one for moderation, drank heavily. He retired to his wedding chamber, collapsed into bed, and never woke up. The medical explanation is straightforward. Attila likely suffered from esophageal varices, swollen veins in the throat caused by liver disease, probably from years of heavy drinking. When you lie flat while intoxicated, especially after a large meal, these veins can rupture, causing massive internal bleeding. The blood flows back up into the nose and mouth. If you're unconscious, you can't clear your airway. You drown in your own blood. It's called aspiration, and it's fatal. His men found him the next morning, the scourge of God lying in a pool of blood, dead from the most mundane of medical emergencies. They were shocked, grief-stricken, and probably deeply embarrassed. This wasn't how great leaders were supposed to die. They were supposed to fall in battle, swords in hand, surrounded by enemies, not suffocate on a nosebleed after drinking too much at their own wedding. Ildiko's situation was nightmarish. She'd just married into power, probably not by choice. Marriages to Attila were political arrangements, and woke up next to a corpse. The Huns immediately suspected foul play. Maybe she'd poisoned him. Maybe she'd stabbed him while he slept. But the physical evidence told a different story. No wounds, just blood from the nose and mouth. Eventually they concluded it was natural causes, or as natural as drowning in your own blood can be. Attila's funeral was elaborate. His men reportedly wept, cut their faces and hair in mourning, and buried him in a triple coffin, gold, silver and iron. They diverted a river, buried him in the riverbed, then redirected the water back to hide the gravesite. Then, according to legend, they killed everyone who'd participated in the burial to keep the location secret. Attila's grave has never been found. But the empire he'd built? It fell apart immediately. Attila had multiple sons from various wives, and none of them could agree on succession. Within a year, the Hunnic Empire fractured into civil war. His sons fought each other, allied tribes rebelled, and subject peoples rose up. Within a generation, the Hunnic Empire had completely collapsed, scattered to the winds like Attila's ashes. All that conquering, all that terror, all that carefully built power, gone because their leader died from something a modern EMT could have handled. The story became legend, whispered across Europe with a mixture of relief and dark amusement. The man who'd brought Rome to its knees, defeated by wine and biology. Medieval chroniclers saw it as divine justice, proof that even the mightiest warlord was mortal. Modern historians see it as tragically ironic, a reminder that power doesn't protect you from bad luck and poor choices. Attila the Hun, conquered empires, terrified continents, accumulated vast wealth and power, and died because he got drunk, had a nosebleed, and was too unconscious to deal with it. His final battle wasn't against Roman legions or Gothic armies. It was against his own blood and gravity, and he lost. The scourge of God defeated by his nose. Sometimes history's most embarrassing deaths belong to its most terrifying figures. And there you have it. Kings crushed by furniture, killed by eels, roasted by doctors, stabbed by dead men's teeth, and embarrassed in ways that echo through centuries. These weren't just bad rulers. They were walking disasters, men given ultimate power and somehow managing to use it in the dumbest ways possible. But here's the thing, they are also deeply, hilariously human. Because embarrassment doesn't care about your crown. It doesn't matter if you rule a kingdom or a cubicle. We all have moments where we make the wrong choice, trust the wrong person, or, in the case of medieval kings, eat 14 pastries and die. These stories remind us that power doesn't equal wisdom. Authority doesn't guarantee good judgment, and a crown on your head can't protect you from your own terrible decisions, your biological vulnerabilities, or just spectacularly bad luck. King John lost the crown jewels in quicksand. Charles II of Navarre got barbecued by his own medical treatment. George II died straining on the toilet. These men ruled nations, commanded armies and shaped history, and yet they were brought down by things so mundane, so preventable, so absurdly human that it's almost comforting. Because let's be honest, we've all had moments of catastrophic stupidity. Maybe you've never drowned in your own blood like Attila, but you've definitely done something while drunk that you regretted. You've never been killed by your own cannon like James II, but you've probably stood too close to something dangerous because you wanted a better view. You've never chased someone on horseback through a doorway like Louis III, but you've absolutely made impulsive decisions driven by attraction that seemed like a good idea at the time and definitely weren't. Medieval kings just had the misfortune of making their mistakes on a grand scale, in public, with chroniclers watching and taking notes for posterity. Their embarrassments became historical record, their deaths became cautionary tales, their poor judgment became legend. But strip away the crowns and castles, and these were just people. Flawed, foolish, occasionally heroic, often ridiculous people who happened to be born into positions they weren't equipped to handle. Some of them, like Alexander Tharasin of Scotland, died heroically but pointlessly, saving others and catching pneumonia as a reward. Some, like Humbert III, spent their entire reigns trying to quit a job they never wanted and failing repeatedly. Some, like Charles VI, suffered from genuine mental illness and couldn't control their delusions. Some, like Louis XVI, were just painfully, catastrophically awkward. And some, like Wenceslaus IV, were probably just terrible people who got what they deserved, roasted cook and all. What's fascinating is how these stories survive. Centuries later, we're still talking about the king who died from a nosebleed, the one who got stabbed by a toilet assassin, the one who ate too much goose and laughed himself to death. Their political achievements, their laws, their diplomatic treaties, most of that has been forgotten. But the embarrassing deaths, those are immortal, because humans love a good cautionary tale, especially when it involves someone powerful being brought down by something ridiculous. There's also something democratic about these stories. In life, these men had absolute authority. They could execute people on a whim, start wars, redistribute wealth, reshape kingdoms. But in death, they're all equal, all equally vulnerable to bad luck, poor choices, and the basic fragility of human existence. The king dies from a nosebleed just like anyone else might. The emperor gets food poisoning from bad eels. The mighty conqueror is killed by a dead man's tooth. Death and embarrassment are the great equalizers, and no amount of power can buy you immunity from either. And honestly, that's kind of comforting, because it means that your embarrassing moments, the ones that keep you awake at 3 a.m. replaying in your head, they're not that bad in comparison. You've never lost the crown jewels in quicksand. You've never been killed by a severed head's tooth. You've never eaten 14 pastries until your stomach literally ruptured. Your worst day is probably still better than most of these kings' last days. So tonight, as you sink into your clean sheets, in your structurally sound bedroom, far away from exploding cannons and assassins hiding in cesspits, maybe whisper a quiet thank you. Thank you for modern medicine that can treat a nosebleed. Thank you for furniture that's been safety tested. Thank you for living in a time when eating too much dessert gives you indigestion, not a royal funeral. These kings lived in palaces, but you live in an era where you're statistically far less likely to die from furniture, food poisoning, or your own relatives. You don't have to worry about succession crises, papal excommunication, or whether your medical treatment involves being wrapped in brandy-soaked cloth and set on fire. You can make mistakes without starting wars. You can have a bad meal without it being your last meal. And maybe, just maybe, these ridiculous, tragic, hilariously human stories remind us that history isn't just dates and battles and political movements. It's people. Flawed, foolish, occasionally brave people who did their best and sometimes failed spectacularly. People who, despite having crowns and kingdoms, were just as vulnerable to bad luck and poor choices as anyone else. So rest easy tonight. You're not a medieval king, and that's probably the best news you've heard all day. No one's trying to poison your soup. No one's waiting in your toilet with a sword. Your embarrassing moment at work last week suddenly doesn't seem that bad when you remember that somewhere in history, a king died because he forgot to duck while chasing a girl on horseback. Sweet dreams. And remember, no matter how badly your day went, At least you're not in the history books for dying on the toilet, getting crushed by your throne, or eating yourself to death at your own wedding feast. Sleep well and be grateful you were born in an era where stupidity rarely results in becoming a cautionary tale for the next 1,000 years.